reading from the Gospel of Mark. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the space they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you in Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Here ends the reading of the words that gave us insight into God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
So today we're starting a new sermon series called Galloping Through the Gospels, because we will be moving through the Gospels very quickly at a gallop. We'll be spending a whopping one Sunday on each of the Gospels, but you know I do like a challenge. So we will kind of do an introduction to the Gospels. We can't talk about everything in them, obviously, in a short sermon. But the goal of this is for you to understand a little bit more about what is unique and different about each one of the Gospels. So when we read through them throughout the year, you have a little bit more perspective into what is going on. So I know that some of us have spent quite a bit of time reading the Gospels, and others of us are new at reading the Bible altogether. So I have a question for you. I want to take a survey here in just a minute. I'm wondering what your favorite gospel is. There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just going to ask, and by a show of hands, I want to see what your favorite gospel is if push came to shove. So if push came to shove, by a show of hands, how many of you would say your favorite gospel is the Gospel of Matthew? A couple Matthews, okay. How about the Gospel of Mark? Who would say the Gospel of Mark? Okay, four or five, Gospel of Mark. How many of you would say the Gospel of Luke is your favorite? Several Gospel of Lukes here. How many of you would say the Gospel of John is your favorite? And quite a few. I would say Gospel of Luke and Gospel of John are pretty even. Okay, so that doesn't terribly surprise me. If I were to take this survey in almost any congregation, the results would probably be similar. I think that the Gospel of John typically gets a lot of votes, and the Gospel of Mark typically doesn't get a ton of votes. Typically, Matthew gets a few more votes than Matthew got in this congregation, but that's okay. I love it. I think each of the Gospels is beautiful in its own way. It's unique in its own way. Now, you might say, Caleb, today we're starting with the Gospel of Mark, but why is that? I've read the New Testament, I've opened it, and the Gospel of Mark isn't the first book in the New Testament. What starts the New Testament? The Gospel of Matthew, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why are we starting with the Gospel of Mark? Well, because the Gospel of Mark was written first. The reason the Gospel of Matthew is the first in the New Testament is because the people who put the New Testament together really liked the Gospel of Matthew, and because the Gospel of Matthew is super Jewish. So if you read through the Gospel of Matthew, you'll see a Jewish emphasis. There's a lot of quotations from the Hebrew Bible, for instance. And so people thought this served as a pretty good bridge between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Matthew also has elements that you would typically expect in a gospel, right? Like a birth narrative and a more detailed resurrection story that the Gospel of Mark just doesn't contain. The Gospel of Mark is simpler. It's pared down quite a bit. Have any of you read through the Gospel of Mark? Did anyone decide to read through it this week? Did anyone go through and read it this week? The Gospel of Mark is the first gospel to be written. It's the earliest gospel, and it was probably written around 70 of the Common Era. Now you may wonder, hey Caleb, how do you know that the Gospel of Mark was written first? That's a really good question. Well, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke both contain almost all of the Gospel of Mark in its entirety. Now, if you're more fundamentalist, you might say, well, that's because it's God-inspired, right? God gave the words. But in a thinking congregation, we can't really dismiss it quite like that, right? We have to think of it more like students who turn in the same test. And if Matthew and Luke are students, and they've got all of Mark's essay in their essay, but they've embellished it a little bit, you have to assume that they had a copy of Mark's essay test, right? It's the same when we're thinking about the Gospels, that since almost all of the Gospel of Mark can be found in Matthew and Luke, scholars say Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark as they were writing their Gospels, and they wrote some of their theology into it. So knowing that Mark is the first gospel is something that scholars call Markan priority. Have you ever heard of this? Markan priority. It means that Mark was written first. I also told you that it was written in the year 70 of the Common Era. You may wonder how on earth we know that. I mean, it's not like we have a first edition signed by the author that we can carbon date. No. The reason we know that it's probably 70 of the Common Era is because there's a reference to a historical event in the Gospel of Mark. Now think about it like this. Think about if you were reading a book, not the Bible, just any book, and they make a reference in that book to something that actually happened, right? Then logically you would say, this book could not have happened before that event, right? Or else they couldn't have made a reference to it. So that's how scholars approach this. They say, since there is a reference to a historical event, it could not have been written before that event happened. And the event was the destruction of the temple. So think about the temple in Jerusalem. In 70 of the Common Era, the Romans destroyed all but one wall of the temple, the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. The one that still stands in Jerusalem today, that you've probably seen people going and making a pilgrimage to and placing their prayers in the stones of. So Jesus says, not one stone shall be left unturned. Remember that? It's making a reference to an actual historical event. So scholars say that the author of Mark put that in there. That's how we know that the Gospel of Mark was probably written around 70 of the Common Era. So I know you all are good at math. And so you're probably thinking, wait a minute, 70, the Common Era, wasn't Jesus' ministry like 40 years before that? And you would be exactly right. That's great subtraction skills there. 70 minus 30 is 40, which means that for a period of about 40 years, which is longer than I have been alive, the stories of Jesus existed in oral tradition. That means that they probably were not written down at all. They were told. Okay, so does that mean that none of those stories are true or happened in that way? No, that's not what it means. People took great care with those stories. But we also all have played the children's game of telephone, right? And so we know that as you tell stories to other people, they tend to grow and develop and change a little bit. And so I tell you all of that to say that we need to approach the biblical text with caution. And that's where it gets dangerous, when you start wanting to say, well, Jesus said exactly this, and so it has become law. No, we know from the teachings of Jesus that he was not interested in legalism. That was one of the whole points of his ministry. And so recognizing how the Bible came into being helps us avoid that. And God knows we need to avoid that, because look at fundamentalists in our society. Look at the way that they weaponize the Bible. They try to legalize the teachings of Jesus. The point of Jesus' teachings that we have to keep at our heart and in front of us is his teaching of love, right? As long as we stick with love, we're in good shape. So the Gospel of Mark starts off in an unconventional way. It doesn't start off with Jesus' birth. Have you noticed this? Have you ever read through the Gospel of Mark and noticed this? It doesn't start with his birth. It starts with Jesus on the banks of the Jordan River. It starts off with a roar, which is why the Gospel of Mark is often portrayed as a lion. Okay? It starts off with a roar, and Jesus roars through life. He is baptized, and he begins his public ministry right away. And if you read through the Gospel of Mark, one thing you'll notice is that there is a sense of immediacy and urgency. Okay? The Gospel of Mark's favorite word, I think, is immediately. Because whenever Jesus does something, he doesn't rest or anything like that. He immediately goes on to the next thing. Then this happened, then this happened. It's a sense of urgency that is conveyed in the Gospel of Mark. We also see that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus goes around and does a lot of healing and exorcism. Now, in the 21st century, if we read a lot about exorcism, I don't know about you, but that makes me a little uncomfortable. I'm not real comfortable reading a lot about exorcism. But I don't think we should read those as literal demons, right? In the ancient world, this was both a way of talking about physical and mental ailments that people didn't really understand, and it was also coded language to talk about the Roman Empire, okay? Whenever Jesus exorcises a demon named Legion, for instance, Legion is a Roman army regiment, okay? So whenever Jesus is doing this, the gospel writer is making a commentary on the socio-historical context as well. So I don't think we should get too turned off by the exorcisms that we find in the Gospel of Mark. We also find in the Gospel of Mark that whenever Jesus is confronted about being the Messiah, he always says, shh, keep it a secret. Have you noticed this? They say, Jesus, you're the Messiah. And he says, don't tell anybody about that. I don't want anyone to know that. Don't tell anybody. Scholars call this the messianic secret, and it's only found in the Gospel of Mark. Why? There are two reasons. The textual reason is, one, you'll remember that over the past several weeks I've told you that the Messiah was supposed to overthrow the powers that be, right? It was a political and a religious leader who was supposed to overthrow the Romans and reestablish a kingdom of Israel that he would then rule. That's dangerous. You can understand why Jesus might not want a lot of people thinking that he's the Messiah. That's the in-text reason. But the larger socio-historical context of that is this, that early Christians weren't quite sure whether Jesus actually was the Messiah or not, and this reflects that Christians were still debating this. They weren't sure because he hadn't done the things that the Messiah was supposed to do. Two other things I want to point out. One, as I said, this text does not begin with a birth narrative. Why? Because the gospel writer in Mark is primarily concerned with Jesus' actual public ministry, the things that people actually knew about his life, which means that the tradition of celebrating Jesus' birth developed later and wasn't a part of the earliest Christian celebrations, right? I know we all love Christmas and all, but that probably wasn't a part of the earliest Christian celebrations. And the second thing I want to point out is the way that the gospel ends, which we heard just a moment ago. What did you think about the ending of the Gospel of Mark? The women go to the tomb. They discover that he is not there. There's a young man who says, "He's not here. He's been raised." And then the women run away scared and tell no one. What do you think about the ending to that? Now, you may think, hey, I've read through the Gospel of Mark, Caleb, and there are some verses after that. And it's true, there are, but they were added later. All the ancient manuscripts end just like that, with the women running away scared and no interpretation. And later writers said, you can't end a gospel like that. We need some hope. We need to see Jesus. We need a story about Jesus coming to see the disciples. We need Jesus going into heaven, and so it's added later. But the original gospel ends right there. I think one of the things that this tells us is that the earliest Christians were still trying to decide what they made of the resurrection, how they understood the resurrection, and how they understood their place. I mean, if you think about it, this is actually very symbolic of what the early Christian life was like, right? How were they going to be without Jesus there? They were still trying to decide, and many of them were running away scared for fear of persecution. So these are some of the overarching elements of the Gospel of Mark, and I have just gone through and deconstructed the whole Gospel for you. But I'm not going to leave it there, because this isn't a New Testament 101 class where I then say, okay, now go sit with this for a week and think about what that tells you about your faith. I think the Gospel of Mark is one of the most important Gospels that is so underrated. Because not only does it tell us the most about who the historical Jesus probably was, but it also is a deeply spiritual text that I think tells us some important things about how we live our lives. Right? If I was reading the Gospel of Mark and I said, what is the point of the Gospel of Mark? I would come away with the Gospel of Mark with this notion, that there is a sense of immediacy in the Gospel of Mark. There is a sense of suffering in the world in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus has a holy impatience for dealing with it. Jesus says, it is not okay that people are suffering in the world. It is not okay that my people are suffering in the world. God does not want us to suffer. And he gets to work trying to alleviate people's suffering to the best of his ability. Now, I think that is deeply theological, because we've sat here in church today and we have lifted up a lot of suffering. We've lifted up suffering in our personal lives. We've lifted up the suffering that we see out in the world. We have lifted up suffering of gun violence. We've lifted up suffering of mental illness and physical ailments. We have lifted up the suffering of racism and homophobia and transphobia. There is a lot of suffering in our world, and we as Christians need to feel a sense of immediacy to relieve that suffering in the world. And I am inspired by the Jesus that I find in the Gospel of Mark, the Jesus who says, God is with you in the suffering. God will not abandon you. God is at work transforming your life, and God is at work transforming our world. And we are all called to get to work immediately to partner with God, to be co-creators with God out in the world, to do something about it. So I hope the Gospel of Mark inspires us to be present in the world, to do good things in the world, to bring God's presence into this world so that it might suffer a little less. May it be so, and thanks be to God. Amen.